This is They Create Worlds, episode 251, Virgin Games.
If anybody wants to find me, I'll be in the last place you would look. In a place where people used to be, a land that's called reality, you'll find me there.
Welcome to They Create Worlds. I'm Jeffrey, and I'm joined by my co-host, Alex.
Hello.
Last time we wowed you with crazies and low prices of Mastertronic. This time we get to wow you with corporate shenanigans and Virgin Interactive.
Absolutely. This is in a way a companion piece to our previous episode, our 250th episode on Mastertronic, since there was a brief period of time when Virgin and Mastertronic were one. But really, this is the story of a far more complex company that was known by many names: Virgin Games, Virgin Interactive Entertainment, even at one point the completely and utterly unrelated name of Avalon Interactive, that existed throughout the 1980s and 1990s, had a few big hits, looked like it might become a big thing, never quite established itself, and then just became a massive pawn in all of the corporate shenanigans going on in the wider entertainment and .com worlds of the late 1990s. We'll talk about games a little bit, but Jeffrey, you were not kidding when you said we were in for some corporate shenanigans today, which is one of our favorite things here at They Create Worlds. At least for me. Jeffrey tolerates me. It's fine.
One of the inceptions of this thing was the corporate shenanigans behind Sega, so I have to like it on some level.
Absolutely. We're not going to get quite as twisty as our friends at Sega or Williams, but this still rates as one of the more corporate shenanigan-y stories, and it's definitely, the stakes are higher. I mean, Virgin itself is a minor player, but it was a pawn in games between much larger entities, and so we're going to have to get into some of the corporate shenanigans that were affecting the wider media landscape in the mid-1990s, and it is going to get wild out there, folks, so probably nothing more to do except dive right in.
All right, where do we start? At the very beginning of Virgin, where some intrepid young bedroom coder decided that, making games was fun, or something else completely innocuous like, I'm going to make airplanes, and I decided that video games were better.
Well, of course, the company Virgin Games, which didn't start operation until 1983, is a larger part, or was a larger part for the first part of its history, of the much bigger and more important Virgin Group. So we do need to start to provide some context for what's going to happen with Virgin. We need to start with our very first corporate shenanigans here and talk just briefly, and I do mean briefly, about the history of the Virgin Group and its illustrious co-founder, Richard Branson.
So this is corporate shenanigan appetizer.
Indeed. It's the corporate shenanigans you eat before you eat. Bonus points if you get that reference. Richard Branson is such an interesting character, and we're not going to spend a lot of time on him because Richard Branson wasn't particularly paying attention to what was going on with the little game thing. So we don't want to get too sidetracked, but Richard Branson is a bold, brilliant, somewhat volatile and unpredictable entrepreneur who has involved himself in almost all aspects of just about anything you possibly can, from retail all the way to airlines and everything in between. He started out as a struggling high school student, or the British equivalent, the English equivalent, who one of his teachers once said was either going to end up a millionaire or in jail. He was dyslexic and suffered from ADHD, so he was a very poor student, but he was very smart, and he ended up dropping out of school at 16 in 1966. He was born in 1950, to found a magazine with another fellow by the name of Nick Powell called Student. This was a magazine, as the name implies, that was targeted at students. But the thing that made this magazine different is it was getting real. Like, it was getting to issues that teenagers really actually cared about. the counterculture, Vietnam, revolutions, all of the crazy things that were going on in the 60s and would have been sanitized in more mainstream British publications aimed at youth in Britain. Student was covering that stuff. It became very popular very fast and became very successful. Off of the back of the success of Student, Branson and Powell decided that it would be a good idea to start selling records. This made perfect sense because at the time in Britain, there were price maintenance practices going on in the high street record shops. This is something that we talked about very briefly in one of our Magnavox episodes, so not in regards to records, but the idea of price maintenance. Not that I expect anyone to remember that from back then. It was a minor point, but I like making Jeff dredge up old episodes to put into the show notes, so I mention it.
I suffer for you.
Indeed. The idea of price maintenance is that you have collusion amongst shops to keep prices at a certain level. You might call it price fixing, except price fixing is illegal. Price maintenance, for reasons that I don't understand all the distinctions of, wasn't. The idea that you're not going to go below a certain price on products, that's kind of the idea of price maintenance. Because of price maintenance, the cost of records in Britain was kind of artificially high. I mean, we're not talking about you had to be a millionaire to buy records, obviously, but the prices were a lot higher than they really needed to be. Branson and Powell got the idea that we have this magazine. Teenagers are the buyers of records. They're one of the main drivers of record sales. We have this magazine that is going out to teenagers. We can start a mail order record business to offer them records at a far better rate than they can get in the record shops because we're not going to be involved in any of that price maintenance nonsense. So we can undercut and maintain our margins. In 1970, they established Virgin Mail Order to sell records that they advertised in their student magazine. The name Virgin had no big origin behind it. It's just this was a business that they had no experience in, that they had never been in before. They were virgins in the record business and in the mail order business. So Virgin it was. This was in 1970. 1971, this is going so successfully that they open their first actual retail location to sell records under the Virgin name. Then in 1972, with the money that he's been making, Richard Branson purchases a somewhat larger residence in Oxfordshire and opens up Virgin Records as a recording studio. The idea behind Virgin Records was very similar in some ways to what they were already doing with things like Student Magazine, which is, let's take a chance on the young and unproven. This is a side business for us. Let's just go out there, see who's out there that isn't getting a recording contract, see if we can do something with them, that kind of thing. They have their first major success in 1973 with the English prog musician, progressive rock musician, Mike Oldfield, and his album Tubular Bells, which is a truly massive hit in the United Kingdom and puts them on the map. They start getting more people in. They start recording those acts that nobody else will record. So they become the home for the Sex Pistols, which were the major progenitor of punk rock and also so toxic for a variety of reasons that no record studio would touch them. So they had some big success with the Sex Pistols. They got some other acts, including more conventional acts, to start recording with them as well, like the Rolling Stones. And pretty soon, Virgin Records was a really big deal. From there, Mr. ADHD, adventuresome, entrepreneurial Richard Branson just starts going out in all sorts of other directions from there. Gets into retail, really into retail. I mean, they had record shops going back to the early 70s, but bigger high street retail establishments in 1979. In the 80s, he starts doing the airline thing, Virgin Airlines. Other side businesses just always growing. It's in this context that Virgin Games first comes into existence. Despite the fact that Branson likes to expand into everything under the sun, it wasn't actually coming from Branson, who wouldn't have been paying attention to something as small as the British computer game business in 1982, 1983, which, as we talked about just on our last Mastertronic episode, was still very small and hardly established at that time. He's not the one that came up with the idea of getting involved in that space. Instead, it happened because of his expansion in the retail business and his desire to hire a young executive who we mentioned very briefly in our last episode, but did not cover in detail, by the name of Nick Alexander. Nick Alexander had experience in the music business and he had experience in the retail business. He was a marketing guy. He had started out at British Rail in the 1970s, then he moved on to EMI, big British record label. And from there went to work at HMV Retail, which is a big retail company in the United Kingdom. While he was at HMV, he kind of got sick of the whole retail thing and noticed things were starting to happen in computer games and video games, and ended up returning to EMI, or to, by this time, Thorn EMI, to work in their video game division. They were one of the very early British companies that had a division, and they were working on video game and computer platforms. They were also doing their own experiments with early video disc systems. They had their own proprietary system that they were working on. Well, actually, it wasn't theirs, but they were working with a proprietary system from Japan, the VHD video disc system. He thought that was kind of cool, and so he went back there and worked for them for a little bit. He was very taken with this nascent space. I don't think he was ever a game player either, just like our Mastertronic people last week, but he was very taken with the market and with the idea. Right in the middle of all of this, he gets a call out of the blue from Richard Branson, who in this time period is expanding the Virgin retail establishment. Alexander has experience in that space, and so Branson called him because he actually wanted him to be the managing director of Virgin Retail that was opening the Virgin superstores and all of that kind of thing. Alexander was like, I'm flattered, but what I really, I'm burned out on retail. I don't want to do retail. What I'm really interested in is this computer game stuff. So he started trying to convince Branson, why don't we do computer games together? He gets the sense, because he's been interviewed, a lot of this comes from a profile in Retro Gamer magazine on Virgin Games, but he's been interviewed a few places. Branson didn't seem interested in that at all, but he really wanted Alexander on board for the retail thing. So he basically, it sounds like from the way Alexander frames it, he was basically agreeing to whatever Alexander wanted just to get him into the company. So it's like, yeah, sure, set up a game company, whatever, you can do that, and then we'll do some other stuff together. So in early 1983, Virgin Games is born. This is the very early period, as we talked about in our Mastertronic episode. It's not very established yet. Alexander's basically just doing what everyone's doing. He hires a small staff, and then they put out the call for submissions. They start getting tons and tons of submissions, largely from bedroom coders, because that's the UK scene at this time. There's nothing particularly remarkable about that early output. It's the similar kind of things you're seeing everywhere. Some of them were good, some of them were bad. They were pretty indiscriminate in the first couple of years, 83, 84. Some of them were good, some of them were not. The company wasn't making a lot of money. Branson actually kind of pulled everybody off of it for a while, and Alexander and his team were actually some of the main people doing a lot of the design work for the launch of Virgin Airlines, because it was just kind of small potatoes. But, they hung in there. They started to get a little better. He brought in a programmer, one of the rare women programmers around the game business in those days, though her programming hadn't been in games really, named Patricia Mitchell, who could do a better job of kind of screening the submissions. They try to go for a little more quality, and they get a little better in the middle of the decade. Probably the most fondly remembered games that they did in this time period is the Dan Dare games, based on an old comic strip character. They were arcade adventures, and they had a kind of comic strip kind of look to them as befit the character. Not something, if they were released in the US, they were never big in the US, but definitely fondly remembered by British gamers of a certain age. They also ended up doing a couple of acquisitions. They bought a company by the name of Leisure Genius, which happened to have the rights to Scrabble, computerized versions of the Scrabble board game, as well as some others like Monopoly and Risk and Cluedo, which is the British name for what we Americans call Clue. In 1985, they got Leisure Genius, and those were good, solid sales. Like, there was nothing exceptional about Monopoly, Cluedo, or Risk games, but that gave them, some good, steady sellers underpinning the thing. They're just kind of there for the most part. They're not a particularly distinguished publisher, but they're also not a terrible publisher by any stretch. And of course, it's at this point that Mastertronic enters the picture. Now, we got a lot of corporate shenanigans to do, so we're not going to tell the whole Mastertronic history again. We just did that. Even I don't tangent that hard, Jeffrey.
You sure?
Most of the time. If it had been 5 episodes ago, I'd probably do it. Since it was 1 episode ago, we'll let this one go.
Okay. Just this once.
So to briefly recap the history of Mastertronic, no, just kidding. So as we talked about in our last episode, budget games by this time were very important. This is a segment of the market that Virgin wasn't really in, and a segment of the market that was eating into their traditional market. So they thought it would be a good idea to be in the budget game business. Mastertronic needed more money to pluck up those Sega rights to the Master System distribution, as we talked about in the last episode. So it was a pretty good match. In 87, Virgin takes a 45% stake, and then in 88, they buy the whole thing, which becomes Virgin Mastertronic. They do very well. This is the period where they start rocketing to a little bit of success. There's also big things going on in the United States in this time period, which we promised that we would talk about in more detail here, because part of getting Mastertronic also meant getting Mastertronic Inc., the American development arm in Orange County, California, that was being headed up by one of Mastertronic's co-founders, Martin Alper. That in this period of time, starting around 1986, was for the first time getting serious about establishing itself in the American market. They'd tried a couple of things in 84, 85. We went over that in the last episode. But it was mostly them trying to make deals to bring some of their British software to the United States and kind of establish a budget area in the US with that software. And that was never successful. There's a mismatch. Americans weren't necessarily as interested in budget. It was a more affluent crowd that was buying a lot of these computer games, so they didn't necessarily need budget software. Also, it was a disk-based market, and it was already an IBM PC and Commodore 64 market. Mastertronic in Britain's on the C64, but of course the Spectrum's still big there, and that doesn't translate at all. So it was just a mismatch to try to do that. So by 1986, Martin Alper's actually getting serious about, okay, let's establish a development division here, which he does in California, and let's try to do actual stuff. And it takes a couple of years to really start building that up. But he starts bringing in some really talented people, either in-house or as contractors, because, of course, Mastertronic, being in the budget business and having such widespread distribution, they know all of the great programmers, some of the old bedroom coder crowd from the United Kingdom. And Alper starts luring some of these people over to the US. He's also a very good deal maker, and so he starts looking for licenses that are maybe a little off the beaten path, that are falling under the radar of the bigger companies, the Electronic Artses of the world, who can get far more interesting licenses, but still provide some name recognition and, more importantly, co-op advertising. In other words, the brand holders are willing to spend marketing dollars to help promote the games when they come out as well. This starts turning things around a little bit over there. They get involved on the NES. They do some interesting stuff there. One of those things being the Cool Spot puzzle board game kind of game, created by Graham Devine, who is one of these bedroom coders who was brought over from the UK, was one of the founding members of the development arm of the company in the United States, after being a teenage prodigy programmer for Atari in the UK for computer conversions in the early 1980s. Spot doesn't seem like a big kind of get. He was very ubiquitous. I mean, I remember 7-Up commercials with Spot back in the late 80s, early 90s. I don't know about you, Jeffrey.
I do. I remember that very much.
Indeed. So, he was a pretty ubiquitous, recognizable character. And the thing is that 7-Up was willing to, like I hinted at before, put marketing dollars behind these things. The nice thing about some of these brands, like they had Spot and they had McDonald's. So, I mean, they've got food and drink companies, which have mascots. There's Ronald McDonald and all of his friends at McDonald's, and, Spot here. they have mascots, so I mean, there's a recognizable character, but they're not necessarily as precious. You know, when you get a Batman license, I forget which Batman game it was off the top of my head, but, you know, one of the people that worked on that was like, you know, we were having conversations about the length of his ears. And, you know, the ears are only made up of like 3 or 4 or 5 pixels. And we're having conversations about the length of the ears. There's a lot of things you can and can't do with established licensed characters, whereas these may be kind of low-hanging fruit kind of characters that are not as interesting. But there's also less restrictions on their use. And so something that really defines Virgin in this period, I think, very well, is that they're making good games and just not thinking about the license. Like, the license is in there, but the game is coming first rather than having to portray a particular character in a particular way. And that's what leads to something like Graham Devine's Cool Spot, which is one of their kind of breakthrough hits on console platforms, released in 1990. We'll hear more about Mr. Devine later, or Devine, most likely. However he pronounces it. Devine, potato, potato. I could look it up. I'm not going to, because then you can't make fun of my pronunciation. You, the listener.
Oh, I can make fun of you all I want.
Well, yes. There's that podcast producer that laughs at everyone's misfortune. Let's all laugh at him. No, let's not. Yeah, so they're getting established a little bit on console. They've got the European Sega distribution, which is pretty huge. So they're starting to make a little bit of a name for themselves. But the thing is, the Virgin Group is kind of a weird place. They are in so many different kinds of businesses. They're so successful in so many of them. But Richard Branson is constantly looking for new places to go and new things to do with his business.
They're sort of like a wannabe Procter & Gamble.
Sure. Even though they're bringing in a lot of money, they're also very cash-starved as a company. Not just Virgin Games, but like the Virgin Group. Richard Branson's umbrella corporation for all of this craziness. As we kind of hinted at in the last episode, I mean, we talked about in the last episode, but we didn't go into super detail because we were saving the Virgin side of the story for this one. The Sega business was great, but it had a lot of overhead. You had to purchase a lot of expensive stock that you were then going to be holding on to, or retailers were going to be holding on to on your behalf for a long time before it finally moved through all the channels and sold, with the biggest sales coming at Christmas time, you know, for the hardware. This was a kind of awkward business for Virgin to be in because they weren't necessarily at Virgin Games or at Virgin Mastertronic flush with cash. So this is what led to the decision in 1991 to sell that part of the business off to kind of break up the company that was Virgin Mastertronic, which we talked about a little in the last episode, but we do have to repeat here just for the context. Nick Alexander has been in charge and has continued to be in charge of the Virgin Games organization. Under him has been Frank Herman, who had been the MD at Mastertronic and who was responsible for a lot of the Sega stuff going on. Then Alan Sharam, who was doing a lot of the distribution stuff. These are gentlemen we talked about in the last episode, no need to repeat. And of course, Martin Alper has control of the US branch of this whole operation. They decide to untangle the Sega aspect of it. Sega is interested at this point because they've made enough money in just taking everything over directly rather than going through proxies. They establish a new Sega Europe in 1991, and they invite Nick Alexander to be in charge of that. Frank Herman goes along as well. Alan Sharam goes along, and that part of the business is cleaved off. Virgin is left with their development and publishing organization in the UK and in the US. The one part of that Mastertronic portion of Virgin Mastertronic that's really staying around is Martin Alper and his development group out there in California. This also means that Virgin Games needs a new head because Nick Alexander's leaving. He's going to be the managing director of Sega in Europe. Of course, this is not a sudden or shocking departure. Like, this is a planned disentangling. Nick Alexander is staying around long enough to help find his replacement at the company. You know, they can kind of wind this whole thing up gratefully. The person that he and Frank Herman, who's also involved in this, and Robert Devereaux, Richard Branson's brother-in-law, who is the head of Virgin Communications, which is kind of the arm of the company that Virgin Games reports into. settle on as the logical choice to be a new managing director for Virgin Games is a gentleman by the name of Tim Chaney. Tim Chaney knows British retail software distribution. He came up with Commodore in the UK and was responsible for software sales in some capacity. He might not have been responsible for all sales, but he was involved in sales of software at Commodore UK in the United Kingdom. In 1985, he joined US Gold. We probably talked about him in the context of US Gold, but it's been a while since we've done that episode, so you'll just have to listen for yourself and find out, since Jeffrey now has to put it in the show notes since I uttered the words. The word is given. Warp speed, Jeff.
Oh, dear. I'm doomed.
Bonus points if you get that reference as well. He joined US Gold when it was really starting to get its distribution operation going. It was on its way through Centresoft to being, for a time, the largest distributor of game software in the UK. We talk about all of that in our US Gold episode. He was intimately involved in the running of that with Jeff Brown. He had contacts with the retail establishment. He had contacts with the local publishers. He had contacts with American and Japanese publishers that US Gold had been doing licensing or distribution arrangements with. He had a web of contacts that made him a very logical choice for this kind of role. However, he had stepped away from all of that. In April 1989, he felt that US Gold was basically at its pinnacle. He was kind of done with that retail side. He wanted to go back to something small and entrepreneurial. So he got together with Anton Bruhl, who we briefly talked about last episode in the Mastertronic context, former head of Atari International during the heyday, and then a major consultant in the game space through his IDG company. And another guy named Manlio Allegra, who was a major licensing agent for computer games and such in the United Kingdom. They formed a company called Tech Magic together that was going to be a publisher of Sega games, particularly for the Master System. By 1989, 1990, the Master System was all but dead in the United States, but it was actually still really popular in the United Kingdom and in Europe, and it would remain so even after the Genesis took off. Again, you've got a more cost-conscious market. In the UK, you also have a market that basically skipped the console scene in the 80s. There were consoles in the 80s. Obviously, Mastertronic was releasing some of them, but the console business was never that big. In the early 1990s, the Master System was, at times, even more popular than the Mega Drive, though both were very popular. It was a platform that was being neglected by US and Japanese publishers because the system was dead in those markets, but it kind of made sense to create a publisher of Master System games in the UK market to do conversions of popular games from other formats. It did pretty well for itself. It was doing okay when, in early 1991, as this split is being contemplated between the Sega stuff and the Virgin stuff, Nick Alexander and Frank Herman and Robert Devereaux come a-calling to ask him to be the new managing director of Virgin Games. They had to woo him a little bit, you know. You got to romance a guy like Tim Chaney. It's like the Crushinator in that regard.
Maybe just a bit.
Because he thought he was done with that kind of retail side, but they finally end up getting him on board. And I mean, at this time, they're a small company again. Because, I mean, the American stuff is starting to happen, but it's still very early in 1991. Like, Cool Spot in 1990 is the first game that really gets much notice. They were really small at this point just because, like, the Sega business had become the tail wagging the dog, and that was gone. Virgin Games had never had all of that distinguished software. The Mastertronic end, as we talked about, budget software was falling apart by this time. So it was actually a really small company that he ended up inheriting. But they got a bit of luck for them, not for everybody, when Robert Maxwell famously took a long walk off his short boat. We've talked about that in other contexts, particularly Tetris and the Tetris story. Robert Maxwell, major media titan in the United Kingdom, who died in mysterious circumstances drowning on his yacht. Afterwards, it was discovered that there had been massive and rampant pension fraud going on at the company, and that the company was, his media conglomerate, the Mir Group, was basically bankrupt and in millions and millions and millions of debt to its pension fund that it had been pillaging. The Mir Group had a computer game publisher because kind of in Britain in this time period, Lots of companies were dabbling in that. Mirrorsoft, which of course we talk about extensively in the Tetris story. There's another one you have to pull out now, Jeffrey. An oldie but a goodie from way back in the day. Obviously, Mirrorsoft didn't make it out of this alive. It was shut down, which meant that a lot of people were suddenly available, and also a lot of games were suddenly available. The games just there was nothing, again, particularly distinguished about their UK output at this time. The games were important in that they had them. Virgin didn't have much going for it, and now suddenly they could pick up some of these Mirrorsoft contracts and get some games out and really kind of solidify the balance sheet. More important was that Tim Chaney was able to hire the marketing director, sales and marketing director from Mirrorsoft, a guy named Sean Brennan, who was an incredibly brash and creative marketer, the kind of marketer that does the crazy stunts that get all of the attention, which, if you can pull that off and do it well, can get you a lot of free publicity that's very nice. If you do it poorly, then you become Acclaim UK in the late 90s and get made fun of for trying to get people to name their child Turok in exchange for money. But Sean Brennan, true story, kids, look it up. But Sean Brennan was able to walk that fine line and be provocative without becoming just completely silly. So Sean became a major asset for the company going forward. Now in this time period, the early 90s, there are kind of two stories of Virgin. There really will be for the rest of the company's life. So we're going to kind of look at these two things kind of separately and in turn. In the UK, you have a new managing director, Tim Chaney, that had been involved with the largest computer game distributor in the United Kingdom, US Gold, and had a raft of contacts across not just the British industry, but also the US and Japanese industries as a result. This is what is going to drive the UK branch forward in this time period. They're going to get a few local beloved games, like the adventure game Lure of the Temptress, or Archer McLean's classic pool game, Jimmy White's Whirlwind Snooker. Games that wouldn't resonate to people on our side of the pond, but are very fondly remembered on the other side of the pond. Also Cannon Fodder, a classic game from Sensible Software that Jeffrey and I are actually familiar with, though we discovered it years later through totally not illegal emulation, rather than when it first came out as a Super Nintendo game back in the 90s, right, Jeffrey?
Sure, we'll go with those lies.
So they had a few beloved games there, but the real thing is he started making deals with the companies that he had been dealing with at US Gold to build up really great UK and European distribution for American and Japanese companies that needed entrance into that market, or lured them away from the companies they were already working with, because he knew the business. So he knew what these companies' margins were. He knew what his competitors were probably offering them. He had the backing of the Virgin Group, and at this point, the Virgin Group has a little more money. They're still not flush, but Richard Branson has actually sold the record company, the company that kind of started it all, in 1992 to Thorn EMI for $1 billion. A lot of that's obviously being put right back into the company, but they've got some money to play around with. So he basically goes out and starts stealing from his competitors, especially, though not limited to, US Gold. In fact, he raided US Gold for staff, and then he started going after the developers. Some of the biggest ones he got LucasArts, which had been going through US Gold, all those classic adventure games that they were doing at the beginning of the 90s, and those were particularly popular in Europe, though also popular in America, obviously, as well. Plus all the Star Wars stuff that started coming out, X-Wing, TIE Fighter, Dark Forces, all of that stuff was being brought out in Europe by Virgin Games. They got GTI to switch over to them. In fact, they literally stole them out from under the noses of US Gold. GTI, GT Interactive, was a relatively new publisher in the business at this time. We'll do an episode on them someday. We haven't yet. Not another episode for you to have to dig out of the past. They were relatively new, but they had landed the rights to a little game called Doom 2. May have heard of that one. Now, that's Doom, not to be confused with Dune 2, which is also going to be a part of our Virgin story later. Doom 2 from the folks at id. US Gold had been in negotiations with them. They met at CES, I believe. US Gold left CES thinking that they had a deal with GT. Then once they left, Tim Chaney swooped in and offered more money and stole it right out from under their noses so that by the time the US Gold folks landed back in the UK, they didn't have a deal anymore. Obviously, Doom 2 was a massive retail hit. Sean Brennan's marketing came into play here. As a marketing stunt, they sent various computer game magazines in the United Kingdom bags of offal through the post. That's intestines and other organs, Mr. Jeffrey.
Why?
Because people would ask that same question you just did, and they would get a lot of press coverage for it.
So, a marketing stunt.
It was a marketing stunt. Because, it's like Doom is pretty gory and visceral, so it's like, here's some entrails from like cows and sheep and whatever.
But I don't fight cows and sheep. I fight demons.
No, but you turn demons into entrails.
Yeah. If you're going to send me something, send me demon entrails.
One entrail is pretty much like another to the common man, Mr. Jeffrey. Them demon entrails cost money.
But as a serious entrail connoisseur, I need to know that it's authentic. This is the authentic experience.
But you have to do a summoning ritual. The components are rare and expensive. You have to find a space where people won't mind all the shrieks and the screaming. I mean, it ain't so easy to get your hands on some demon entrails. So, they did the next best thing.
Yeah, I guess you do have to hire a priest or something to do an exorcism if it gets out of control. And yeah, okay, fine.
Another marketing campaign that he was famous for. We'll get to the American development side of things in a bit, but of course, Command & Conquer came out under Virgin through Westwood Studios. They put out advertisements and billboards advertising Command & Conquer that said best high scores, and then put various historical figures like Mussolini, Saddam Hussein, Hitler, and French President Jacques Chirac on these billboards as best high scores for Command & Conquer. That one got some complaints from the French embassy, a slight international incident. But, it got them the buzz. 1995, they also get rights from Capcom. So they're distributing Resident Evil stuff and especially some computer conversions as well. In the UK, they're publishing some games as well, but their real strength in the UK is this incredible distribution that they have. That's what's driving them forward in the early 1990s. Now, on the US side, things are getting interesting in a different way because development is really starting to take off. It's a very short period of time that Virgin is dominant in this way. But in the 1992 to 1993 or 1994 period, they are actually a very major force on console platforms, and it all comes down to talent. We already talked about Graham Devine, brilliant programmer who did Cool Spot. Another talented individual, though talented in a different way, that comes to the company during this time and is really a major force in making all of this happen, is a guy by the name of Stephen Clark Wilson. Stephen Clark Wilson was a programmer, but he was not a game programmer. He had been a technology and project management guy in more corporate parts of the world, decided that he kind of wanted to get away from that, saw the games industry as something that looked very interesting, and decided to throw his hat in the ring. And this was the same time that they really needed somebody in the United States to keep a better eye on development. They had a lot of games in production. They were having trouble getting them shipped. Clark Wilson came in and he did a couple of things. He got the contracts reorganized around milestones, which means you only get paid when you show progress, milestone payments. That helped kind of get development on track. He gained some credibility by rescuing a game that they had in development with a Sculptured Software, the Utah developer that did a lot of SNES games and ports for people. They had a Robin Hood game under development right around the time that the movie Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves came out. complete coincidence. They were doing a Robin Hood game that had nothing to do with the movie. I mean, they might have known the movie was coming, and that's why they decided it was a good time to do a Robin Hood game, but it was not a tie-in. But this Robin Hood game had been kind of languishing at Sculptured, and then Martin Alper got the rights to the film, Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves. So he's tasked Clark Wilson with going down to Sculptured and helping them rejigger this Robin Hood game going nowhere into an official tie-in to the movie. You know, I wouldn't say this NES game, Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves, is all of that great or remarkable, but it had a strong license. I think probably as much as anything on the strength of that strong license, they got a big cover feature in Nintendo Power. The game did pretty well. I don't have sales figures, but I mean, it did pretty well for them.
Did one of the programmers have a British accent?
Ha! Unlike those other Robin Hoods. Indeed. And it gave Clark Wilson some real credibility to start building things up in other places. So he ended up taking over what was going to be the next game featuring the character of Cool Spot. Martin Alper wanted him to make an adventure game around it. Clark Wilson thought that was vaguely ridiculous. He was really enamored. He had been a Disney freak for a long time. He really liked Walt Disney movies, Walt Disney, everything. He had been really enamored with the platforming game that came out in the early days of the Sega Genesis, Castle of Illusion, that was created by a Japanese developer, but had really outstanding animation for the time. He was really focused on turning the company into more of a direction of doing games like that. Doing platformers that had kind of that smooth animation thing going on. He went out and started looking for talent to make some of these games that were not traditional video game people and were kind of more in the art and animation side of things. Not famous people necessarily, but people who were kind of more in tune with that than in having grown up as being game developers, kind of replicating this kind of Disney idea. There were several people that one could mention, but probably the most important of those was a gentleman named Mike Dietz. Mike Dietz was a self-taught animator that was working in commercials that Clark Wilson discovered, who was just absolutely incredibly talented at animation. Clark Wilson brought him into the company. Now, there was one other thing that was really important here, because it's all fine to bring in these art people. You know, he wasn't only hiring people in-house, but he was also consulting on improving animation, worked with a guy that we talked about before in the context of Activision by the name of Bill Croyer, who would collaborate a bit later than this, I think, on a Pitfall game with Activision. Disney animator that had done Fern Gully, The Last Rainforest. Brought him in as a consultant who hooked them up with a company called Metrolite that had a system for scanning and painting cells, digitally painting cells, which is something that was absolutely state of the art at the time. So they got this really great animation stuff going at the company, far better than the animation that you were finding in most other console companies at this time, like really groundbreaking stuff. And then they had one other secret weapon, which was a programmer by the name of Dave Perry. Dave Perry is just one of these absolutely brilliant bedroom coders from the early days in the United Kingdom. Similar to Graham Devine in that respect. Again, I'm sure somebody that the Virgin people and Martin Alper and whoever knew about because they were so embedded in that scene. He was still a high school student, like literally a teenager, around 15, when he first discovered computers and discovered that he was really good at programming them. There were a lot of bedroom coders, but I mean, most of them were just dabbling in a little BASIC, maybe learning a little assembly on these primitive systems. But Dave Perry was kind of a certified genius at programming. He was introduced to the ZX81 and ended up getting one of those. Started submitting programs to magazines at the time as kind of like type-in listings or whatever. They were so good that one of the people at one of these magazines proposed that they go in together to create a programming book for the ZX Spectrum. And they end up he ends up putting out this book, Arcade Games for Your Spectrum Plus and Spectrum, that would sell 8,000 copies. He was only 17 at the time. This was like around 1983. He was able to enter the game industry on the basis of that. He joined a small UK publisher called Microgen, put out some things there. And then as that company was starting to fall apart, he went off to form his own development house, working with publishers to do conversions and ports and all of that kind of thing. He ends up getting contracted by Virgin to do a game based on the first Terminator movie. After that, Martin Alper convinces him to come out to the United States, never been before, to join him in California and help out on the programming side at the company. You know, if there are two people, obviously there are a lot of people that contributed to some of these games, but if there are two people that contributed more than anyone else to some of the success that was about to happen, it was Mike Dietz on the animation end and then Dave Perry on the programming end, because what he discovered is that when he was trying to figure out how the Genesis worked, the Mega Drive / Genesis, he was working on like poorly translated or barely translated developers' manuals from Japan. He misread them and accidentally discovered how to double the throughput to the processor in a way that you weren't supposed to be able to do.
But that's good.
It is good. You know, I mean, he didn't get in trouble for it. I mean, when I say you're not supposed to, it's just the system's not supposed to work that way. Or at least if it was supposed to work that way, Sega was keeping it a secret. It was keeping it proprietary.
How do you think blast processing works?
Right. Yes, exactly. So he could program games that could go really, really fast. Combined with the incredible animation and art staff that Clark Wilson was bringing into the American branch of the company, this means they could create some absolutely gorgeous games with fluid animation that went really, really fast. Dave Perry first used his talents on another McDonald's game, for this time for the Genesis Global Gladiators. Then he moved over to the Cool Spot project, and his engine from Global Gladiators was used to do the Cool Spot game for the Genesis. Then they landed the crown jewel of all of their licensed platforming endeavors, which was the Disney movie Aladdin. Under normal circumstances, Virgin would have never gotten the license for Aladdin. Virgin's having some success here. They're making some pretty good games, but their licenses are mostly second tier. Cool Spot, McDonald's. Terminator was a big deal in 1984. In 1992, Terminator 2 is the big deal. Terminator 2 is not the license Virgin has. Virgin has the license to the Terminator. They have small licenses. Like, they're making some great games. The Spot games, even the McDonald's games. Like, they are competently built games. But they are second tier or third tier licenses. The Aladdin rights have been split between two companies. Two big players. Capcom has the rights on the Super NES. Sega itself has the rights on the Sega Genesis. Sega has contracted the development of this game to one of their most dependable and reliable development partners, Blue Sky Software, down in the San Diego area, California. But Blue Sky has run into a lot of problems. First of all, they're doing two big licenses at once. They're doing both Aladdin and Jurassic Park. Aladdin's all fine and good, but Jurassic Park is Spielberg. That's even bigger than Aladdin in terms of the potential return. So they have a lot of their resources going over there, and they're kind of neglecting the Aladdin project. The stuff they're working on is not terrible, but they're having trouble nailing the Disney animation style as well. And the Disney people really, really want this to feel like a Disney production. Like, the technology is to the point now in the video games that you can make things that seem kind of like living cartoons. So they're really, really trying to nail that. And Blue Sky, for whatever reason, is just not nailing it. At this point, they're kind of in trouble, and Disney's not happy. They're thinking, there's a small window for a licensed product like this. It doesn't look like it's going to be done in time to the level of quality they want. They're thinking of dropping Blue Sky and going with another developer. It just so happens that a producer at Disney, Patrick Gilmore, had seen the Global Gladiators game at CES in 1992. That's the McDonald's game that Dave Perry did with his incredible engine that makes the games go so fast. Gilmore was blown away because, it's an incredible platformer. Just in terms of how it moves and feels and plays. It's not special in other ways because it's just a McDonald's whatever, but it's really well made. Gilmore remembered that. As a result of being so impressed by Global Gladiators, Disney ends up giving Virgin the rights to make a game based on The Jungle Book. Again, it's kind of second tier, right? Because The Jungle Book is a 1960s movie. Aladdin is the current hotness. Jungle Book is beloved by a segment of the population, but it doesn't scream 1992. But because they have that Jungle Book deal, when the Aladdin development kind of goes sideways, Virgin is able to swoop in and make a deal with Disney and Sega in order to take over the Aladdin project. They have almost no time to get this done. Disney has put a hard date on when this game needs to come out. October 1993, because that's when Aladdin is going to release on VHS. Virgin gets the contract to do this game in January of 1993. They have 6 months to develop this game because you need a couple of months lead time to, duplicate cartridges and get it into stores and all of that. They have 6 months to make this game. That's better than E.T.'s 6 weeks.
But only barely.
But games are also a lot more complicated in 16-bit than they were in the Atari 2600 days.
Just a bit, yes.
On the plus side, though, they get access to Disney animators who actually help them do some of the keyframes and whatnot. Of course, they just have absolutely brilliant individuals like David Perry and Mike Dietz, David Bishop, a producer who's also a very good game designer. There are other people, obviously, that contribute as well. I can't name them all here, but, it's a cast of characters, obviously. It's not just any one person. They get this thing together, and it's really good. It's a really fondly remembered game, and it's far more fondly remembered than the Capcom Super Nintendo game that came out at about the same time. Have you played the Sega Genesis Aladdin game?
I have not. I've only played the Super Nintendo one.
They're similar in some ways,
but very different. I'm skipping through a playthrough of the Sega Genesis version. I'm like, SNES didn't have that, didn't have that, didn't have that. That level is completely different.
Yeah. And it's so well put together. Like, it has a lot of nice touches when it comes to the animation. The vibrancy of the backgrounds, the cute expressions and motions that a lot of the characters go through. It's just really well done. And it's a cut above a lot of the other games at the time. Even big games like Sonic or whatnot. I'm not talking about in every aspect. I'm not necessarily talking about in gameplay. I'm just talking about in vibrancy and animation and, speed and just how well it's put together. There are very few games that hold up to that same level. It's truly, truly well done game. And it's a big property. We don't have a good source for sales figures, but one number that gets bandied about that I have not been able to confirm is 4 million units sold. I'm not sure it actually sold 4 million. It may have been less than that because I haven't been able to track down this number to a reputable source. It's been around forever as a number. But remember, that's all on one platform because they don't have the Super NES rights. That's just on the Genesis. It's a massive seller. Even if it didn't sell 4 million, I'm sure it sold at least 2 and maybe more. It's a really big deal. One of the best-selling third-party games on the Sega Genesis, period.
Which makes them lots of money, and Disney lots of money, and makes everyone very happy.
And it also gets them the rights then to make a Lion King game as well. So they make the Jungle Book, David Perry and crew go on to do that, but they also get the rights to do the Lion King. That is a good segue into the other side of the business, which is their burgeoning computer game success that they're having at the same time. Because in addition to all of this stuff going on console, where they're making really groundbreaking platform games in terms of their technical competency, they are also doing some really groundbreaking stuff on computer platforms in the United States. None more so probably in terms of the hype at the time, even if it doesn't hold up as well over time, is The Seventh Guest. We've already done a whole episode on The Seventh Guest, and we've already done a Dragon Con presentation on The Seventh Guest.
And we already stabbed a poor defenseless blue screen to death at said Dragon Con.
We did. And if you join our Patreon, you can see exactly what Jeff is talking about. That's right. We have one of those that we never advertise. It's complicated. Anyway, we won't go into it again here because we already did this, but this was Graham Devine, the genius prodigy programmer that worked for the company, and then Rob Landeros, who had been their first art director coming from CinemaWare, who started looking around at technology out there. Landeros started going around to conferences to see what was new and exciting, discovered the CD-ROM, and thought it would be great if they could produce some kind of game involving CD-ROM. Very famously, when Devine and Landeros brought this to Martin Alper took them out to lunch and said, "You're fired." But he said that because he knew that this was something that would need to gestate, that would take time, that was going to be revolutionary, but they'd need to figure it out. And that he knew in the high-pressure environment of Virgin, where they were churning out these licensed games, very competently made, but still, kind of just churning out licensed game after licensed game to turn a profit, he knew that it wouldn't get the level of attention and care it needed. So instead, he dismissed them from Virgin and invested in setting them up with their own company, Trilobyte. They create The Seventh Guest, releases in 1993. And as we talked about in our Seventh Guest episode, it is one of the games that really becomes the killer app for the adoption of CD-ROM drives and multimedia PCs. Multi-million seller and a huge deal. The other thing that's going on in this time is there's a little company out there called Westwood Associates that has been a porting and conversion house for half a decade or so, and has just started dabbling a little bit in its own independent software and is trying to make a name for itself, and decides that they're going to make an adventure game called Legends of Kyrandia that is going to be a fully icon-driven interface, something that at the beginning of the 90s was still very rare. Usually had parsers, and even in the case of the Scum engine, where you had point and click, the early Scum engine, you were pointing and clicking on actual verbs on the screen and then clicking on objects. This would be a fully icon-driven interface. They take it to Sierra. Ken Williams says, "That's great, guys, but now let me show you this game we're working on, King's Quest V." They already had their own icon-driven interface. They didn't need another one. But he was also impressed enough that he wanted to buy the company. He wanted to bring them in-house. This is a period of time when consolidation is happening in the computer game industry because retail shelf space is getting harder to come by, especially if you don't have a big fancy affiliated label program like the Electronic Artses of the world. Williams needs more companies, more games, more programmers in his stable, offers to buy them. But he's not interested in Kyrandia. They're taking it around to others as well. Virgin is real nearby to Westwood, so they show the game to Virgin. Martin Alper is much more impressed. He agrees to publish the game. Then he hears that Sierra wants to buy Westwood, and not to be outdone, he's like, well, if they want to buy, we definitely want to buy you too. We'll buy you. At this point, Brett Sperry and Lewis Castle, the founders of Westwood, were not particularly interested in selling their company, had not thought about it. But with all of these offers coming in, they decide, well, maybe this would be a good idea. Then we don't have to worry about running a business. We can focus on making games. Sierra, I think, offered more money, but Virgin offered more control. Williams at Sierra wanted to take more control from them, whereas Virgin was going to give them more free reign, and so they went with Virgin. Westwood ends up becoming a subsidiary of Virgin Interactive. That's what gets them the Dune license to do Dune 2. We're not going to go into super huge detail on Westwood. We'll do an episode on them as a company someday. We've already done an episode on both Dune and Dune 2, both Virgin games, and why they both came out at about the same time, and why Dune 2 is labeled with the 2, even though it has nothing to do with the other game. You can look at our Two Dunes, the Battle for Arrakis episode for that. I'm just making Jeffrey pull all the episodes this time around.
Well, you don't have as many games for me to look up, so of course you got to reference our old shows.
Exactly. Of course, after Dune 2, they do Command & Conquer and Command & Conquer Red Alert, and all of those games are published by Virgin too, because Westwood is a part of Virgin, so they're reaping the rewards of all of that. Virgin, by the middle of the 90s, is becoming a pretty big deal. They have excellent UK distribution, where they're distributing some of the biggest hits, like Doom 2, not being confused with Dune 2, though obviously they're distributing that one as well, in Europe. They have this great run of console games, Aladdin's a massive hit. That gets them the Lion King license. Westwood ends up doing the Lion King because David Perry and company are too busy doing the Jungle Book. Lion King, in some ways, is not as well made a game. It has some difficulty spikes and the like that aren't great. It looks great again because even though Virgin doing it, it's collaboration with Disney animators again and some of those tools and techniques that Virgin as a company has come up with. And The Lion King was a huge deal. It sold millions of copies once again. And it's multi-platform this time. It's not just the Sega version. Lewis Castle has said that Lion King sold 4.5 million copies. I don't have independent verification of that, but I mean, it's believable. Even if it didn't, I'm sure it's still sold in the many millions. So they have all of that going on. They have Seventh Guest as a major hit and a pioneer in CD-ROM games. The Command & Conquer franchise is big. Like, this is a company moving from strength to strength. And it's at this time, Jeffrey, that Virgin Interactive gets caught up in corporate shenanigans.
But when did they change from Virgin Games to Virgin Interactive?
Well, Jeffrey, in a way, that's part of the story. I mean, a small part, but it's there. So the media world is changing in the middle of the 1990s. For the longest time, media distribution, and I'm talking not just video games, I'm talking about music, CDs, movies, was a largely retail-based ecosystem. Go out to the movie theater to see a movie in first run, or you go out to a video rental store to rent it, or you go out to a video store or a discount retailer or whatever to purchase it. You buy music in music stores and record stores and other places. You buy video games and computer game stores, etc. This is the business of media. In the mid-1990s, it really looked like that was changing rapidly. And it has changed today. But a lot of what we have today, on-demand streaming content, downloading stuff directly into your home instead of going out to a store and getting it, that took longer than people thought. But people in the mid-90s thought that was coming at this time. There were a couple of interlocking things going on here. You had a belief that the coming of infrastructure for the internet and for the World Wide Web was going to enhance cable systems in such a way that cable companies were going to be starting to deliver entertainment directly into your home. Not just movies, but also video games. And then, of course, you had the burgeoning .com bubble, where for a brief period of time, anything with internet in its name or .com in its name was thought to be a company that was going to have incredible valuation. Pets.com was allowing you to order dog food online and send it directly to your home. Everyone's going to want that. This is going to be a multi-billion-dollar company. Amazon bringing books into your home? Sounds great. That's going to be a multi-billion-dollar company. They have no sales right now, but yeah, they'll be big someday, sure. Obviously, in Amazon's case, it worked out. Better or for worse. Pets.com, not so much. But it wasn't just the .coms, it was also Comcast, Charter. The cable companies are going to bring content directly into your home. Telecommunications is deregulating in Europe. The monopolistic state-run telecoms are being forced to open up their networks and allow third parties to compete against them. Content in this new world is going to be king. It's not going to be retail. It's not going to be even infrastructure like owning cable or owning a television station. It's not going to be producing the hardware like Sony does with their music players or with VCRs or whatever. It's going to be content. Content is king. This drives a whole buying spree in media where companies that do not have content want content, and companies that are involved in distributing content through traditional methods or giving you outlets to use content through hardware, through traditional methods, feel that if they don't have content, they are going to be the losers. This is why Sony buys Columbia Pictures and CBS Records. This is why AOL and Time Warner end up merging at the end of the decade in one of the biggest of all the big .com busts. These are the corporate shenanigans that Virgin gets caught up in. First of all, that name change from Virgin Games to Virgin Interactive Entertainment. That comes in 1993. The reason for it is entirely the marketing of the times. This is the Sillywood area. Everything is becoming interactive. Interactive movies. Interactive experiences delivered into your home. It's not about games anymore. It's about interactive entertainment. It's about interactive media. It's about something bigger than games. The video game industry is still the small fry. Electronic Arts is not Walt Disney. Virgin is not Paramount. But interactive entertainment is going to make video games as important as movies and other media. We have a Sillywood episode that Jeffrey is now also contractually obligated to put into the show notes.
Wait, I have a contract?
Yes, it's not written, but it is legally binding. I'm your lawyer. I'm telling you this is so.
Okay.
Games is small. Interactive entertainment is huge. Of course, Virgin Interactive Entertainment is also owned by Mr. Richard Branson. It's part of the Virgin Group. The Virgin Group is ever hungry to expand into new areas and is ever mindful of selling at peak and getting out while the getting's good. Virgin Records was basically the origin of the Virgin Group. He parts ways with it. He sells it because he gets $1 billion for it. Richard Branson has never been super interested in the game business, but he knows an opportunity to make some money when he sees it. On around 1994, maybe the end of 1993, who knows, but by the beginning of 1994, he's thinking to himself, I've got a pretty good thing here. It's not an area I'm super interested in, but I can probably get something for it because in this Sillywood frenzy, there are other companies that are interested in this kind of thing. So what they do is they basically start a plan that is going to end up with them trying to sell the company. They do this in stages. They start in February of 1994 by doing a small public offering for Virgin Interactive Entertainment, putting up 16% of the shares. So Virgin's going to stay by far the majority stakeholder. They're opening it up a little bit, but the main reason they're doing this is this allows them to kind of put together a prospectus and put together a formal valuation of the company to show potential buyers the strength of the company and how enticing it would be to perhaps own the entire thing. Because their ultimate goal is really to sell it. There are two main companies that invest during this time period. One of those is Hasbro, which is looking to get back into interactive entertainment, or really to get into interactive entertainment because they missed the boat the first time around. The other is Blockbuster Video. Blockbuster has a pre-existing relationship with Virgin because Virgin is still really pushing the retail stuff in this time period. And when they move into other countries, which they're starting to do, they're starting to expand, they look for local partners. As Virgin is looking to start opening Virgin superstores in the United States, they partner with Blockbuster Video, who already has a very strong retail presence in the United States in the opening of these stores. Blockbuster, actually, even before the public offering, and Hasbro too, in January 1994, Blockbuster purchases an almost 20% stake in Virgin Interactive. According to Tim Chaney, Hasbro was very interested in acquiring the company, but they were only willing to offer in the neighborhood of $20 million for it. Blockbuster comes back and offers to purchase another 55% of the company in June 1994. Deal, I think, finally closes in July for $135 million. So they pay $30 million for their 20% stake, 19.9%, and then another $135 million to take a controlling interest. The reason for this is Blockbuster sees the writing on the wall too. They believe that movies are going to be available on demand through cable networks, which, if you squint, is essentially what has happened today. Obviously, we call it internet streaming, but a lot of that internet streaming is happening on cable. Not all of it, but a lot of it. Blockbuster saw that happening much sooner than it did back in the 90s. As funny as it is, because they missed the boat and missed their opportunity to be successful in this space years later, different CEO, different executives, different Blockbuster. But at this time, Blockbuster saw that digital world coming and they thought, we need to have content because retail rental is not going to be the future. So they buy a majority stake in Virgin Interactive Entertainment. They had previously bought a stake in the Spelling Group, which was television producer Aaron Spelling's company. Aaron Spelling was the very well-known producer and hitmaker of such popular network television fare as Starsky and Hutch, The Love Boat, Fantasy Island, and more recently, at that time, Beverly Hills 90210. Again, Blockbuster is amassing content. So Virgin Interactive is just another link in that content chain. So yeah, Virgin comes under the control of Blockbuster Video. But then something even more bizarre happens in corporate shenanigans, Jeffrey.
Oh?
Because a little company called Paramount Communications is up for sale. The parent company of Paramount Pictures. And content is king. So there very quickly become two principal suitors for Paramount Communications. One of those is QVC, the home shopping network. Yes, I know, a home shopping network buying a movie studio? But it's not what you think, because at this time, QVC is run by a gentleman by the name of Barry Diller. Barry Diller was a legend in the motion picture and the television business. He ran Paramount Pictures for 10 years, from 1974 to 1984, most of that time when it was under the control of Gulf and Western and Charles Bluedorn. Responsible for turning Paramount into, at that time, the #1 movie studio by the end of his time. He then went on and helped to found the Fox network, the fourth network for Rupert Murdoch. He went to QVC because he wanted to run his own thing. He wanted to be his own entrepreneur. But when he went to QVC, he immediately made deals with Comcast and the Liberty Media Group to tie up the company's stock in this complicated three-way thing. Because what he saw is a future where QVC is not hawking stuff on television that you call in to order, but he's seeing them as going through cable networks like that owned by Comcast and delivering directly into the home in that way, online ordering. He's also seeing this as a conduit for entertainment media. He's not really QVC. He's looking at building his own media conglomerate in this new direct cable entertainment environment that he sees developing. Barry Diller at QVC, with the backing of Comcast and Liberty Media, is trying to buy Paramount so he can run his old studio again. The other suitor is Viacom, which at this time is owned by a gentleman by the name of Sumner Redstone. Viacom started as the syndication division of CBS Television. Its job was to sell syndication rights to CBS Films to independent stations so that they could run in syndication. It dabbled in a few other things besides distribution, including a little bit of cable. It ended up in a tie-up with Showtime for a while. Then it ended up purchasing Showtime, and then MTV, which was also the owners of VH1 and Nickelodeon. They were building a television station kind of media empire. Again, content is king. It's attracted the attention of Sumner Redstone, owner of a theater chain called National Amusements, who then bought a controlling stake in Viacom in 1987. Again, somebody in a traditional field, movie theaters, that realizes that the future is in digital entertainment and cable entertainment, whether that's cable networks or the internet or whatever. This is the media future, and he wants a part of it. And then Sumner Redstone also sets his eyes on Paramount Communications. The bidding war gets really fierce between these two companies. At the end of the day, it looks like Barry Diller is going to win and Sumner Redstone is going to lose. Barry Diller has better backing. He has more money. Blockbuster Video has already done some investment with Sumner Redstone as part of what's going on here. Blockbuster Video is sitting on $125 billion of cold, hard cash. So Sumner Redstone buys Blockbuster Video. Viacom buys Blockbuster Video solely so that they can access those cash reserves and up their bid for Paramount Communications. They end up winning the war. The Blockbuster part of the merger is disastrous. It never makes sense. It never does well. Sumner and Viacom take on an enormous amount of debt to make this happen. But he gets his prize. He gets Paramount Communications. So Virgin Interactive Entertainment, which had been part of Blockbuster, or more specifically, part of the Spelling Group owned by Blockbuster, is now owned by Viacom. This all happens kind of boom, boom, boom. Blockbuster announces its intent to buy Virgin in June 1994. The Paramount deal finishes in July of 1994. So just kind of boom, boom, boom. I'm not sure of the exact timeline. I could look it up. But this company that was once part of the Virgin Group is now suddenly part of Viacom. There's just a couple of problems here. First of all, as I said, Viacom took on a ridiculous amount of debt in order to make this purchase happen. They ended up in a shotgun wedding with Blockbuster Video that was really not great for either company. They're kind of hemorrhaging money, and they're not interested in trying to nurture or grow anything outside of their core business. That includes a video game company like Virgin Interactive. Even worse, Viacom is one of these companies that got in on the whole Sillywood thing. They had founded a company, Viacom New Media, a couple of years previously to try to leverage their brands like MTV and Nickelodeon in the video game space. They lost a lot of money doing it, and it did not go well for them. Sumner Redstone was not particularly interested in being back in the video game business or the interactive media business again. That's really not where his priorities are. They're at a parent company that doesn't have a lot of money to invest, probably doesn't want to invest a lot of money in them anyway, because they already tried the whole video game thing and didn't like it. At the same time, everything is starting to go south at the kind of on the development side of Virgin. David Perry and Mike Dietz and most of those talented people that were behind games like Global Gladiators and Cool Spot and Aladdin decide to strike out on their own and found Shiny Entertainment. And they make a deal with Playmates. So all of that talent that was working on those console games, pretty much gone. Also, their reputation in that space had largely been built on their great scrolling and animation, sprite work, and their 2D engine and all of that stuff. 3D consoles are coming. Polygon-based consoles are coming. PlayStation's coming. All of that expertise, no longer relevant. That whole interactive movie craze, falling away entirely. The sequel to The Seventh Guest, The 11th Hour, is a disaster, oft-delayed, over-expensive, not much of a game, sinks in the marketplace. Westwood is still doing well. Westwood still has its Command & Conquer series that is very popular. Everything else, though, not so much. They need a lot of money, really, to reinvest in talent and infrastructure and product. They have a parent company that is just not going to get that to them because they have overspent in the media wars of the mid-1990s, and now they are suffering very heavily. Virgin Interactive's losing money because most of their games aren't successful. Viacom is not interested in bailing them out. So Viacom very quickly decides that, well, not very quickly, it takes them a couple of years, but by 1997, Viacom is done with all of this and they are ready to sell the company. But Virgin's a weird company. At this time, as the development is failing in the United States outside of Westwood, the UK and European distribution stuff is still doing pretty okay. So the strength of the company is in European distribution. They are weak in development. The major companies in the video game industry that might be interested in what Virgin has are basically only interested in Westwood Studios. Because like everyone else in this time period, they're not interested in infrastructure. The big companies already have infrastructure in the video game business. They don't need European distribution, or they don't want to take on European distribution if they don't already have it. They need content. Content is king here, too. It's the same telecommunications, boom, .com bubble, everything else that's fueling everything. Westwood has great content, but nothing else does. Virgin doesn't have any other viable intellectual properties. So there are companies that they have talks with. They talk with Microprose, they talk with Electronic Arts, they talk to GT, some of the major players. But none of these companies want all of it. They don't want the UK stuff. They don't want the lesser development studios that aren't generating hits. But Viacom just wants to wash their hands of this whole thing. They are refusing to sell it off piecemeal. This goes on for about a year when finally Virgin Interactive's still such a money loser and Viacom just needs to get out of this. They finally agree to a piecemeal deal. They came close at one point, I don't know exactly when, to a deal with GT, but it fell apart. Finally, in August 1998, Electronic Arts buys Westwood Studios and the development group in Irvine, the original Virgin American Development Group, for $122.5 million, with the prime goal of getting the Command and Conquer franchise from Westwood. That basically divests the American side of the company. I don't know if that was technically quite everything in America, but whatever wasn't snapped up in that just got shut down or whatever. So now they're left with this European company that has great distribution but doesn't have very much product, especially since they've just lost their good American product. What good American product is left? They'd like to get rid of this, but nobody wants to take it, so at the moment Viacom's just kind of stuck with it. Tim Chaney is still at the UK company. He's still the managing director in Europe. So he comes up with a pretty cool and novel idea to create something of a partnership with Interplay. Interplay at this time is having some of their own problems, but they have some decent content. They have some franchises that are viable, but they don't have any European distribution. Virgin has great European distribution, but at this point they have very little product to put into the marketplace. They need more. They create this complicated tie-up where they essentially merged their distribution operations together. Interplay bought 49.9% of Virgin, and they kind of created a co-distribution arrangement. Peter Bellotto, who was the head of Interplay's European distribution, Interplay closed their European distribution, and they kind of turned Virgin into this joint thing where they each had roughly 50% stake, and Bellotto and Chaney ran it together. They became the distribution for Interplay. I'm not sure that I really know all the ins and outs of this relationship either. Not because of an inability to understand it, but because it's been poorly reported on, and so it's kind of hard to figure out exactly what the corners of this deal were. But basically, you have an almost 50-50 split ownership between Viacom and Interplay. Interplay's European distribution is now being entirely run by Virgin. This created something of a strange situation when Interplay itself was soon after sold, because Interplay is having a lot of trouble at this time. This deal is consummated in February 1999, and then in July 1999, Interplay is purchased, or a majority stake of Interplay is purchased by the French publisher Titus Interactive. This again goes back to the weird media environment at this time. This is a period of time when the French took over a lot of the American computer game establishment. Between them, the companies Ubisoft, Infogrames, which we've done episodes on, now you have to put those in the show notes too, Titus Interactive end up buying a lot of the major mid-tier publishers in the American computer game industry. The reason, again, goes back to this telecom stuff going on, because France was deregulating its telecom industry, which meant that companies other than French Telecom were going to be able to set up their own telecom networks. And those networks were going to need content. That content was thought to include a variety of things, including games. So there was suddenly heavy investment on the Paris Bourse, the primary stock exchange of France, in publicly traded French software publishers. So Titus Interactive was a pretty nobody small company in terms of what it had accomplished. But it had a lot of capital because it had been heavily invested in as part of this run on computer game company stocks during telecom deregulation in Europe, which is just crazy. So they purchased Interplay because Interplay was having trouble and was available. But then they realized when they purchased Interplay that the European distribution was completely entangled in this joint arrangement with Virgin. So in order to take full control of Interplay, including Interplay's European distribution, they basically had to buy Virgin Interactive too to make the deal work because of this strange tie-up. So Titus is really just interested in Interplay, but they end up buying Virgin Interactive, what's left of it, as part of this deal. So now Virgin is just kind of there. They don't have much. They mostly just have European distribution. They don't have much else going for them. I mean, they have some other stuff. They technically still have some development here and there, but it's nothing important. Tim Chaney ends up leaving the company in 2002. He actually buys the Spanish branch from Titus and forms a new company called Virgin Play around it. Meanwhile, Titus is now in huge trouble because, as I said, Titus was able to expand quickly because there was a lot of investment in the company during this telecommunication stuff and their plan, and they took on a lot of debt to make these purchases to get bigger, but then their plan was to use various tricks on the stock market. I don't know exactly what. That's not my area of expertise. But they were going to use various methods and mechanisms available to them on the stock market to kind of make this whole thing work out and keep their debt manageable. Then the dot-com bubble burst, and suddenly Titus had a load of bad debt that they could not do anything with. So they entered a period of complete and utter crisis as a company. In the middle of this, in July 2003, Titus renamed Virgin to Avalon Interactive. Don't know why. They probably wanted to distance themselves from the Virgin name, or maybe Virgin asked them to distance themselves from the Virgin name. I mean, at this point, they haven't been owned by Virgin since 1994. They're still called Virgin Interactive, even though they have nothing to do with the Virgin Group for almost a decade. Finally, when Titus Interactive filed for bankruptcy in January 2005, most of Avalon was shut down. The remainder was shut down in November 2005. They'd completely disappeared in the Titus bankruptcy. That's it for Virgin. I mean, it's a strange little company. They had some hits in the early 90s, but really the story of Virgin is more just a company that got caught up in the crazy frenzy and spending spree around media companies in the mid-1990s and really never had a chance to set an identity for itself for a brief period of time, largely through the good work of their American branch and Martin Alper and their distribution strength that came from Tim Chaney and his experience from US Gold in Europe. For a brief period of time, they had something, but they never had the opportunity to grow beyond that because they just got caught up in other people's drama. They were just a pawn on a chessboard between Richard Branson's Virgin, who just always was looking for ways to make a quick buck to expand into other areas, and then Blockbuster and Viacom, who were looking to increase their powers in the media world, but weren't necessarily interested specifically in what Virgin had to offer, and then just kind of sold for scraps and then disappeared in the conflagration that brought down the brief French hegemony of the American computer game industry. A lot of corporate shenanigans, but there you have it.
Corporate shell games, I would say.
Indeed.
Find the Virgin Interactive here, or here. Make big money in the dot-com bubble.
Indeed.
More corporate shenanigans than we typically do, but a lot of it, but very interesting. You just have to wonder what the companies are thinking at the time when they're doing this. It's just like, you're dealing with people's livelihoods in some cases. You're dealing with this other stuff. It gets so big at some point that you just have a numbers game going on that's just insanity.
Yeah, well, Jeffrey, all I can say is that if all goes well, I am sure we will meet again in .com 2, the quest for more money.
Oh, goody. I feel totally comforted by that.
So, how are those AI stocks looking these days?
I'm not touching that one with a 20-foot pole.
Moving on.
What will we be talking about in our next episode?
Well, Jeffrey, I think it's time to touch on another 21st century topic, and one that is very near and dear to my heart, because there was recently a new oral history book released on the story of harmonics and the beginnings of the Guitar Hero and Rock Band franchises. There are also a few other oral histories and interesting sources out there on the web as well, so I think the time is right to look at the rise of the plastic instrument rhythm games and their almost as quick fall. I personally loved those plastic instrument games, still do, even though I don't play them, for lack of good plastic instruments anymore. They rose to incredible heights, to dizzying highs and terrifying lows, and maybe even the occasional creamy middle in kind of the end of the aughts, beginning of the 2010s. I think we got enough perspective now that we can take a look at that.
Does that mean we also get to learn the history of Dr. T and Resort Number 7?
I suppose it just might.
And you get to discover the mysteries of that nightmare next time on They Create Worlds. Check out our show notes at podcast.theycreateworlds.com, where we have linked to some of the things we discussed in this and other episodes. You can check out Alex's video game history blog at videogamehistorian.wordpress.com. Alex's book, They Create Worlds, the story of the people and companies that shaped the video game industry, Volume 1, can now be ordered through CRC Press and at major online retailers. Feel free to email us at feedback@theycreateworlds.com. Please consider supporting us on Patreon at patreon.com/theycreateworld. If you do sign up, please do so through the website and not through the iOS app. This saves you from the 30% Apple markup. We understand you may not be able to financially support us, but you can still support us by leaving a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or the podcasting service that you use. We now have the podcast available on YouTube. Please like and subscribe. Intro music is Airplane Mode by Josh Woodward, found at joshwoodward.com/song/airplane mode, used under a Creative Commons Attribution License. Outro music is Bacterial Love by Roll Music, found at freemusicarchive.org, used under a Creative Commons Attribution License.